Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Conflict Consortium's virtual workshop. To get everyone started, we have some general principles which we sent to you up front, but essentially the most important ones that to remember are a 1 and a 2. A 1 is get you on the queue, and basically you can ask a question of any sort, on or off topic. You are the topic effectively at that point. A 2 is an immediate interruption on a specific point. That takes about like 30 or 40 seconds to get into. It doesn't go on too long. So if you're somewhat long-winded, that will be a 1 by definition. 2s are more or less on point. I'll keep the cues. Try to hold it up there until you see a thumbs up for me to indicate it, and then we are otherwise good. Megan's going to get us started with some comments. Then the presenters have a chance to respond back, and then open to the floor. All good? Okay.
The presenters aren't going to summarize at all. So I'll start. Oh, can you see me?
Yeah, Megan, go ahead. Sorry.
Do I have something to... You can see me when I talk. I don't need to push anything.
Nope. We see and hear you.
Okay, great. So, well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to comment and to read this really interesting paper. I think, first of all, the study is really interesting and original, and it's refreshing to see someone look at an acute refugee crisis and take advantage of recent events in a way that answers theoretically interesting questions, but is also policy relevant, and also a really nice contribution to a literature that has so far been based on aggregate data and starting to look at the mechanisms. So I'll essentially go in order of the paper. I've written up some comments, and I'll add to them after hearing the whole conversation. And feel free to interrupt if anyone has a point related to my point, or if I've misunderstood something. I'm certainly possible that I've misinterpreted numbers and things like that. So my main comment, that's his overall perspective, is that it's some places in the paper, the language tends to slip into connecting refugees directly with conflict. And I think the abstract is correct in saying that it's really testing how the information links to attitudes and changes attitudes. So I think that the case for the paper, as well as additional funding to do additional research like this, would be to connect the change in attitudes more strongly with actual conflicts. And I'm not sure that a lot of research has done that. But I'm thinking of Nathan Kalmo's work on the U.S., where he talks about symbolism and inducement and language that invokes fear actually leading people to participate more in violence, or language or literature on fear and anxiety in political speech and how that actually propels people more to hatred and violence. And I'm not sure I'm too much about that literature, but I think it would be really useful. Especially since this is I think you can make the case that this is such an early phase in the refugee crisis in Turkey, that even though the results and the effect sizes are not, and the authors are very appropriately and nicely modest about the overall results and potential confounding factors, but if there is an effect so early that there doesn't seem to me any research that I know of that connects changes in attitudes and how long it takes before refugees start to create resentments. So if there was a way to, any literature that shows the presence of refugees over longer periods of time, you could really make the case to do another round of this survey experiment to see, in a year or so, if exposure rates have changed, if attitudes change, and then again, that actually makes a stronger case for the importance, the significance of the results, because it is so early, and if there's a conflict going on in Syria, people have maybe a little more understanding, but if they might get refugee fatigue after a while. So, and unfortunately, I can't recommend too many specific pieces, but I was brainstorming a little bit, and some might come to mind that I'll forward to the authors. The second main, I think I'm focusing on the main, significant comments and then some smaller ones, is that the survey was in June 2014, which happened after the Gezi Park protests And I think that it would be good to look at the timing, just consider the timing of the survey and the potential of the salience of those events and support for that event, and the nature of the survey, since it may or may not have an effect on recency bias and things like that. But again, if you could make the case that you want to repeat the survey in another time to see if these are persistent effects. And I know there's not much work in survey experiments that looks at persistence of treatments over time, and I think this would be a really nice context in which to do that. Again, this is not within the scope of the particular research, and the paper does a really nice job of focusing on the studies that have been done and the 4 mechanisms by which refugees can cause conflict, but I think the readers will start immediately to think of potential other ways in which refugees may or may not cause conflict, and one that came to mind immediately is political ideology and the spread of ideas so radicalization, like the Talibanization of Pakistan, for example, refugees coming over and bringing a certain archaic ideology. Stories about oppression from the host country where people then actually might develop grievances against people inside the host country if they are participating in participation. And also possibly endogenous effects of refugees, the refugees themselves experiencing negative treatment inside a country and then feeling grievances and using those grievances in the country. So I think that those are minor comments since that's not what the literature has discussed. But I also will, in the written comments, thought of a few others that might be worth mentioning as potential factors that aren't or have not been considered by the current study or other studies. And just if some of the language says, like, for example, on page 3, it causes, the language of causality is used, like it causes them to be more supportive of the Gezi Park protests. And again, I was to think that just it's associated with support for the Gezi Park protests, but the treatment didn't cause support. But I mean, for the most part, the paper is very careful about not over-claiming, and I think it's just saying that these are associated with the attitudes, and that just the attitude change is potentially huge if the attitude change persists over time. And you could draw on past conflicts like the Afghan refugee situation, where 1.5 million refugees remained in Pakistan 20, 30 years later, and it wasn't until later that that conflict starts to emerge, or maybe even crime. A third point is defining what conflict is, since the aggregate literature focuses on civil war and sort of massive instability, and the paper does a good job of pointing out that there are so many contextual effects in these cross-national studies, the nature of the host country and the strong state, and the study controls for that by focusing on the strong state with Turkey. But the Gezi Park protests, the peace process, and group violence, it seems to me in the Turkish context, conflict means something different than the original literature talking about civil war. That conflict, that it's already constrained, so maybe just defining what it is you mean by conflict, and the importance of, again, that it's actually a stronger finding even in the Turkish context, where generally violence is not accepted, and that even in this context you see some support for group violence. I thought, kind of surprised, I'm not an expert on Turkey, but I thought, wow, people support group violence even in this context where there's a strong state and they're afraid probably of protesting. But it might be useful to sort of look at like the history of, maybe summarize the history of conflict in Turkey and what conflict means and instability, since the general literature, I think, is talking about massive state disruption or even state failure like Somalia and Sudan, and at least when I think of this literature, I think of Africa and civil war as opposed to just social conflict. And then linking that social conflict to things that are costly to societies, even if they don't lead to civil war, I think would be interesting. So just defining what you mean by conflict, especially since you're like asking, is it inducement or hate speech that can lead to violence against individual refugees, and what are the that might spill over into escalate into something more. In terms of methodological, I think that the case is really made as a catalyst for violence. Many of those conflicts. I'm just going through each page. I'll save some of the specifics and little things for the written comments. The next major thing is methodologically, I was a little bit confused about the designation of OHAL, the historical. This had a history of conflict because it was designated in 1987 in a state of emergency, and so I was maybe I should ask a question about what that means. Does that mean there was conflict just prior to 1987, and there was a very intense period with the PKK? I also wanted to know if those are areas that are heavily Kurdish to begin with, and maybe a little more in the background about why it is that those particular areas were violent, and if that violence has persisted. Because this using the method of stratifying the sample, I wondered to what extent those areas overlap with refugees, maybe some descriptive statistics or a map about those areas and the overlap with refugees, as well as the Kurdish population in each, and if there was any information about more recent exposure to violence in this 1987, or maybe this designation occurs every year, and so it's continuing.
Megan, 1 second. Jacquelien, can you mute your microphone? I think you might be the one that's kind of adding on to some extra background sound.
I can mute it, yeah, no problem.
Okay. Megan, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, okay, thanks. Yeah, actually I was thinking of the little Walking Dead stuff. Great. So I don't know if you want to answer that now, or maybe I didn't read carefully enough about the OHAL designation.
Sorry. No, I can just like 1 minute. So one of the OHAL, I mean, one of the reasons why we have that as our measure of violence is those were the areas. I mean, they are heavily Kurdish, but it's where there was the state of emergency declared when the conflict was going on, and also saw the most intense levels of violence. Originally on our survey, we were also asking about individual level victimization, but the issue that we had with that was that basically our enumerators were told that cannot, we can't ask that. PKK is still active in those areas, so it's an imperfect measure of violence, and I mean it's not that it was renewed every year, but basically it's an imperfect measure of the areas that had the highest levels of conflict. I do think though one thing, just a slight pushback, is that I actually think there was a lot of violence. I mean, in the Turkish-Kurdish conflict, I mean, there were, about 35,000 people that were killed. So yes, it's not a massive state failure, but I think, to recognize it, it was a pretty intense conflict. That's all I'll say.
Okay, yeah, no, so that makes perfect sense. I think just actually explaining a little bit more and maybe presenting some of in the background about the nature of that conflict and how many people died, and maybe even some of the more recent incidents. In fact, there was an anecdote buried in the paper about some violent incident against some refugees, and I thought it would be really nice to sort of start with that as a vignette or something about what does conflict mean in this new context. But your explanation is perfect. I think it's just a matter of explaining it, and then the potential confounding issues. If they're mostly Kurds in those areas, their attitudes, I know you're controlling for that, but their attitudes may be more sympathetic toward conflicts if they're Kurds, and I'm just interested in seeing the descriptive statistics about the overlap in the three stratified areas and how many non-Kurds are in the OHAL areas. And looking at that might, I think, make the case even stronger for some of the findings that you've got. If certain small subgroups within the stratified areas. So let's see. The background sections. Oh, so okay. So the Gezi Park and the backgrounds on the Gezi Park. It's kind of linked to this comment about attitudes that I think in the background sections can be made a bit more, connect a bit more to the overall theoretical literature about instability by talking about violence. But also, from what I know about Gezi, there's the development stuff, and then you often summarize it as demands for good governance. And I wasn't sure the mechanism by which people would, because of the refugee exposure, would necessarily support better governance, especially if they perceive that the refugees are being taken care of. And my sense from reading about Gezi Park and a friend who was there at the time, although I'm not an expert on Turkey, is that it was sort of like the Occupy movement, in that there were so many different grievances that came out after the initial demonstrations began and the backfire. So I'm not 100% convinced that there's a strong connection, especially since it seems to have turned into sort of an anti-AKP protest, whether or not, and the locations of those protests, whether they correspond to the sampled areas, and if that, the attitudes are sort of general, that it's just an anti-AKP attitude in the stratified sampled areas, or whether those people actually may or may not have participated in it. So if it's something that happened distant from them, maybe it's just a stand-in for anti-AKP. And I also wondered why, obviously you're limited by resources and you want to sample the areas, but why not have another stratified sample of people who are not at all in the any one of the three regions, to see whether they promote or support violence and may even be using the refugees. Or just like, many people in Texas don't like Mexican refugees, but there are plenty of white politicians in the U.S. who have no exposure to refugees but use that as a way to get support or play on people's fears. So I suspect that it would, if you were able to do another round of sampling, it might be something to address with the viewers, as to why not have a control group that is completely, or a representative group from outside of the three stratified areas.
Can I just jump in? Sorry, I think we did have a control. So like we had the people that were highly affected along the border provinces, and then we had provinces that were not OHA, like weren't in the Kurdish conflict, weren't in the border regions, but we're also not we would try to avoid sampling Istanbul because it's so different from these rest of these areas. So that was our control, but that's a good point.
The border of the border, or the, anyway, there was still like one removed, but I don't know enough, maybe just a map of the places. Yeah, so that makes sense. You don't want to sample people from Turkey because they're potentially from everywhere else. Sample Istanbul. That makes sense. But it's not a major. And I was sort of, again, this issue of defining what conflict is, and I'm just curious about, maybe in the background, what kinds of military means or other studies have been done about what kinds of tactics the Kurds in particular support, or like what kind of tactics are being used. Again, it's like, what is the range of conflict that people have supported in the past? Because the Gezi Park protests and the peace, again, the peace process is a peace question, but just what is the range of sort of the worst possible, like, most significant violent event that's occurred, and how it's been received in Turkey, that would strengthen the results and show the potential for these attitude changes, that even if the attitudes are not very strong now, that persisting over time, it could really change the balance of support for violence. And okay, so
Megan, let's give him a shot at getting some responses, and you seem to be incredibly thorough. So
yeah. So, and I've written up. I'll write up some of the smaller comments, especially on particular tables and things like that.
Okay.
So
okay. Sorry. I'll keep it short because we got a lot of people, and I want to get their feedback. But yeah, no. I think there were some really good points. I think one of the kind of key things that you brought up that we also recognize is, obviously it's a limit, is where we're surveying attitudes, right? These is not directly kind of conflict. So there's, somebody could say, right, is, well, I don't believe that attitudes map on to violence, right? Mm-hmm. And I would argue, well, there's a lot of literature in psychology. I know Nathan's work on that, but even kind of more so is that generally kind of attitudes precede behavior. And there is some, there's some stuff where that's not always true. But I think in the aggregate, I feel comfortable saying that people who are more supportive of the peace process are also probably less supportive and less willing to participate in violence. I mean, but what our kind of argument is that we're not actually interested in the fighters per se themselves, but sort of more generally, politicians, we think, prime attitudes and use these, as you say, use these as a way to kind of scapegoat out groups, but also to gather support. So in some sense, this is kind of is an interesting thing, is the attitudes themselves are politically relevant to the divisions in Turkey. But I think you're right, is to kind of really be very careful about what we mean exactly by attitudes and how this connects to sort of broader levels of conflict. Yes, we'd love to know support for bombings of military installations or kidnapping Turkish soldiers. I mean, we were somewhat constrained in the kind of questions we could ask because some of these areas there still is very active PKK presence. So we kind of had a list of our wish list questions, and then we had our list of our questions that we could actually ask. But that's a good point. I mean, the other thing that I would like, and you brought up that would be very helpful, is we are hopefully planning to do a follow-up in the region. I think the main thing is partially to see what's happened after Kobani and sort of how that's affected our results. But and one of the things though is I think, and we kind of really want to hopefully separate this out, is that there is conflict that has somewhat spilled over after Kobani, but that's not a result of kind of the refugee situation. That's a result of what's happening in Syria. But that's also kind of an interesting mechanism because it's it's not directly related to the refugees, but it is kind of correlated. So sort of unpacking those things is something that we hope to do. Your point about Gezi Park being a measure of anti-AKP sentiment, I know the Gezi Park protests were mostly obviously concentrated in Istanbul. They did spread across Turkey. But I agree is that one of the strongest predictors is negatively correlated is AKP support. So yes, it's probably picking up sort of anti-incumbency. We argue that, and I think we have pretty good support that that's somewhat related to some of the governing tactics that Erdogan has used. But you're right, is that it could be just simply anti-incumbency. But that's all I'll say, I guess, for now. But I really appreciate your comments; were incredibly thorough. So thank you so much.
And let me just make one more comment about the experimental design. That I'm looking at the questions for ethnic balance and militant ties. Mm-hmm. In the ethnic balance question, you say the refugees are threatening the peaceful coexistence and bring the fighting from Syrian civil wars. And then the militant ties question also says these relations threaten to destabilize parts of Turkey. And since you bring up sort of in both vignettes or the fighting or destabilization, and I just wondered if you combined those two groups, if you might even see a stronger result, because there may be some, the ethnic ties argument mentioned violence that could, so I'm wondering if that might have weakened some of the result that you might have seen had you not included bring the fighting from Syria in the vignette about ethnic balance. And if you're going to do the study again, I would maybe take out the part about bring the fighting. Because then I thought, well, I don't know, it seems like you're confounding the treatment.
Like a double barrel kind of.
That's my major comment.
I mean, that's a fair point. I think, though, the one thing that we sort of, after having gone and visited these places, and one of the things that it's not surprising, but a lot of these areas, so a lot of people, especially along the border, have ties across the border. So it's not as if the kind of upsetting the ethnic balance is not as big of an issue, I think, because a lot of people are already settling in along ethnic lines. So they have relatives, maybe they're from Aleppo, and then they have relatives in Antep, or trading, and so there's these kind of sister cities along the Turkish border. So that was our, ex ante, we were like, this is going to be a really strong issue, and maybe kind of in the broader scheme it is. But in terms of localized, the people that are affected by it, I don't think it's so much an ethnicity story because people are already kind of sorting in some sense, at least those that are living outside the camps. But that's a good point, though, about the treatment. I guess. And then the last thing is Tolga, my co-author, who is following us on YouTube, said that 77% of our Kurdish sample is in the OHEL. So it is predominantly Kurdish, but we do have Kurds that are also outside the OHEL as well.
Okay.
Okay, Q is open. I'm noticing that your mini images on the bottom of my screen are not all moving, so let us also use the chat function, which is to the upper left-hand corner. If you identify if you wish to be up for a 1 or a 2, then we could do that if I don't see your hand. So, so Q is open.
I saw David's hand earlier.
Okay, I just saw him stretching. So David and then Nikki.
Okay, thank you for including me in this. I've never done an online conversation like this, so it's kind of exciting. I agree with a lot of the comments Megan made, especially about framing and linking it to anti-regime activity and violence. Before we dive into other things, I had a hard time getting my head around the treatment and exactly what the treatment is, or if it's actually 2 treatments. And let me explain what I mean by that. As I understand it, the 4 treatments, not the control, but the 4 treatments, before they got the treatment, they got a statement that you describe as a brief statement heightening the salience of the refugees in Turkey. But when you actually read what it says, I wasn't quite sure how to interpret any later effects from your treatments, because this seems like a treatment in and of itself. It says, experts familiar with the refugee situation point out that Syrian refugees will outnumber Turks in some parts of Turkey. They also argue that it is a mistake to call the Syrian refugees guests, as the majority of the refugees will remain permanently in Turkey and not return to Syria. That seems to do more than heighten the salience of refugees in Turkey. That seems to be a treatment in and of itself. And so I just had a difficult time then, in my own mind, unpacking how I should interpret any treatment effects or heterogeneous treatment effects on other groups from those 4 later treatments when this seems to be a treatment. Do you understand what I'm saying? And I was wondering if you could just describe, before we get into other questions, why you phrase things that way and how I should interpret, for example, the last treatment, the positive effect. You're helping women and children and families. I don't understand how I can interpret the effect of that without considering this earlier. They're going to be there forever, and they're changing the ethnic demography on the ground already.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a fair point. I mean, our biggest thing, and I think the biggest worry, and you always, a balance is, one is that we wanted to give people some basic background on the refugees, and you're right, we gave them a little more information than a basic background. And I think from an experimental setting, there's always trade-offs that you make in terms of the information and treatments versus kind of my big thing is that, weak treatments kill, right? And I think the worry is, one is without giving people any kind of sense of what the actual refugee situation is, that this would be, kind of like we would have this kind of vacuum treatment, whereas if we're talking about, familiar with the Syrian refugee situation and not actually telling people what the refugee situation was, that would then be kind of, I would say, almost like I don't really know much about this, and now somebody's telling me about the economic cost, but I have no idea how many refugees there are, et cetera. So our reason for kind of having this strong prime was for a couple of reasons. Was one, because this was right when a lot of politicians had started to talk about the refugees, and this was some of the similar language that they used in terms of talking about that, the kind of the AKP stance was these are guests, right? And just kind of in June, you start to see people say, no, wait a second, these people are here to stay. And that was kind of a shift in what people were talking about. So we wanted to mirror that. And the other thing is we thought, if we didn't do that and we just had our vignettes, then you end up with, one, people could have different ideas about what the refugees are. So in some sense, people would come in with different preconceived notions about how many refugees there are, what exactly is the situation. And you're right, in some sense, we have this kind of like threat. It's like a refugee threat. And then it's like, okay, we're talking about what is the layer on top of it. And so we did kind of lump some of the treatments together to see, is it just that we're getting this massive negative effect? And that's not kind of what we see going on here, that there are these separate effects that we do pick up on. But it's a fair point. It's a trade-off we chose to make intentionally so, is that we'd rather have a really hard treatment and maybe worry about, are we also giving people like a threatening part first? And I think there's good reason to suggest that a lot of the issues that people associate with immigration is part of this threat hypothesis. So you're right, it's not as clean of a design as possible, but we argue, and I'm happy to kind of talk more, is that it's, yes, we're talking about variation. We have a pure control, and then we have this threat plus various mechanisms that we're doing.
I mean,
sorry, go ahead.
I think it does help you explain why you get that surprising result though on the last treatment, right? On the moral helping women and children argument. So it can help you in that respect for accounting for that surprising finding. But I found it very difficult, as you recognized, to compare it to the control in any ways, because it did feel like that earlier. It's more than an informational prime. It's contaminating the other treatments, and so it was hard for me to control it with looking back at the control group. I could still unpack the heterogeneous treatment effects, why people might respond differently. So the Kurdish one, I think, is the most interesting finding. But just the comparison with the control just becomes very hard for me to get my hands around.
Michigan had a quick intervention. Thomas, you're speaking, but you're muted. Do you want to jump in?
No, I mean, that's a fair point. So in some sense, you would want to see, maybe if we were to redo this again, right, you would want to see like a sixth cell with just the heightened threat without the others.
He's nodding. That's good.
Yes, that's okay.
Okay, Eula and then Jennifer.
Can you hear us okay, Christian?
Yes, shoot.
Hi, Thomas. I also had a question regarding the treatment, because I think you measure the salience of how people actually interact with refugees, so I also felt like the prime was kind of confounding that effect with how people are actually, in truth, exposed to this topic. And the second, what I'm wondering about is when what you call a treatment, like when you just read people one statement like this, how much is this actually a treatment? Because I wonder, like, what if someone doesn't believe that to be true? Like, did you actually measure if people agree with that statement? Because maybe someone doesn't have, like, just someone coming and telling me, like, in 2 sentences, here, this is the problem. Is that actually sufficient of a treatment? Maybe I don't agree with this. So, because I've seen experiments where people are given, like, for example, an entire newspaper article that was just fake, where this problem was described with some anecdote and stuff, and I can see how that is like a treatment, but just like someone doing a survey coming to me and saying in 2 sentences, this is a problem, do I actually believe this to be true, and am I then have gotten like enough treatment to give me like good results?
And Jennifer, you had a 2 as well on this point, right?
Yeah, I think pre-testing can solve a lot of these issues that have been mentioned, so especially if you're thinking about doing this again, find some way to pre-test these treatments and find a local population and see, are they receiving this text the way you intend them to? Just more generally on the women and children treatment, because of the issue that was just raised about this lead-in, I don't actually think it's a positive treatment, and so you have almost about 100 words of fairly negatively toned text, and then the women and children treatment is probably half that in length. So I think that's why it has a negative effect in Figure 4. So if you're thinking of doing this again, and one of the stated purposes of the women and children treatment was to balance out the negative tone with a more positive tone, but then also to reflect the nascent views in Turkey that Syrian refugees are Turkey's brothers and sisters. You actually have some text in the paper where on page 9 where you mention that a significant portion of the refugees are opposed to the Assad regime and they're therefore political allies. Building in some of that, I think, would make this a much stronger positive treatment if that's what you really want. And in general, I was a little worried about the differences in length across the treatments. I think you should strive to have them be the same length in terms of the number of words. I mean, ideally, they should be completely equivalent in terms of the strength of the persuasive message, and they should only differ in terms of the theme that they're trying to make salient. And I think they're a little noisy in that sense. And so if you've got the chance to redo this, you just might think of some of those issues.
Thomas?
Yeah, I mean, so I see some of the issues that are being brought up. I think is mostly centers around what are our treatments actually doing and what are they driving at. I mean, I think one thing, so our idea, and yes, we thought about, okay, so, do we show people a fake news article, right? But in some sense, then you're going into these people's homes and you're showing them like a fake news article, and I see that as, I don't know, I'm a little, I guess, more sensitive to deception, right? If you're going in there and showing them a fake news article about refugees, rather than, obviously it is a bit more of an agnostic kind of prime that we're doing and saying this is what experts say right? And this was true, is that this was what some people were saying. I think the main thing that we, in the way, and I guess it's a question of interpretation. I mean, what we're talking about is sort of, okay, if we heighten threats about refugees, which is what a lot of people argue that politicians do, and then we test the various mechanisms through what we're doing. I mean, in some sense, I see it more as, okay, we're having a stronger effect, right? This is a stronger treatment than just kind of the base treatment. So the fact that we're not finding those effects, I see that, if I were arguing that, we found these huge effects that make people more supportive of violence, then I think we could have kind of a bigger quibble with the issue about, we have a really strong, two strong negative statements following each other. But the fact that I don't sort of see, I guess, as big of an issue. I see it, in kind of follow-up, I mean, there are ways to tease this out a bit more. But I think since we're arguing in general, it doesn't seem to increase conflict. I don't see as big of an issue there. That's my interpretation of it. But I could be just supporting my attitudes bringing in conjunction with the paper. So I'm a biased source.
No, you being sensitive is really, I'm liking that a great deal. Nikki.
All right. Hi, everyone. Hi, Thomas. I enjoyed reading the paper. I really like it. So I have three kind of brief comments, and one is on the framing, and the other is on the theory, and the final one is on the mechanisms and what they're picking up. So the framing, you start out by framing this as kind of, all right, refugees cause violence. There's this paper by Gleditsch, by so-and-so, and I'm going to speak to these things. I really don't see the paper that you wrote is really about this, and here's my quibbles with this. First of all, you yourself concede, based on a literature review, that it may be the case that refugees do not cause violence in very many of these settings, and so, and it's really conditional on a lot of things, such as weak capacity and so on, and Turkey doesn't even have that. And that's kind of an additional problem. You never really talk that much about how Turkey is different or belongs in a set of other cases, where sort of the whole sort of, now we'll be telling, this will be a story about actually sort of a route to violence in those countries, and a behavioral story of that will be a survey experiment, becomes really, really strange in my mind. So I don't know. I think that this can much more easily be framed as a paper about, look, refugees oftentimes enter a whole bunch of other countries, and sometimes there's a ton of them, right? And so we really want to know what happens, and it's immensely interesting to simply understand how different minorities in those countries and the main group perceive the refugees and sort of what they associate them with. And you can speak about this literature about ethnic conflict and about the conflict spilling, and you can bring it in, and it's going to be interesting. And some of it maybe you can sort of speak to, but otherwise it just feels very forced and coerced, and I'm frankly not, as I said, I'm not buying it. The other thing on the theory, so we're not really given enough, a lot of theory. Some essentially theoretical things appear in a footnote 7, if I'm not mistaken. We're never really told why we should expect different effects for different groups. We're never really told why some terms are interacted and not others. So, for example, I don't understand why AKP, that is whether you like the AKP part, is not interacted with the other stuff. So I'm really not, I think you should do this sort of far more simply and walk us through a simple model of, okay, here's two groups, one is the main group, here's the smaller group. When I highlight these things to different groups, this is what I expect. Because I never kind of got this. I was okay, it's kind of complicated. It's well written. I mean, it's a nice paper. It's a rich paper. But I felt lost, and I don't think you want that. And my final sort of big picture comment has to do with some of your most interesting findings concern support for the Gezi Park protests. Now, the most immediate things that you can pick up, so if you read Zahler and so on, so by the way, I recommend reading Zahler. I recently did so, and the book is really good. I was ignorant up to now. So the thing that you can most immediately track is how I feel about the refugees. So you're telling me a story about the refugees, you're asking me, how do you feel about the refugees? So I'm going to feel how I feel about the refugees. Once it becomes how you support the Gezi Park protests, I'm really lost what you're picking there, right? I mean, Gezi was about so many things, and so your interpretation that this is about they're looking for a place on the bargaining table, maybe, right? I mean, maybe they're asking for better governance. But again, if that were the question, then there's a much more direct way of asking this. I mean, what do you think about how the government is handling the refugees, about government policy, about. I mean, I don't know. I mean, so I like it, but you would kind of want to really tell us more, and then again, this can come up in the theory development, more about why is it that you think that these particular answers are picking the kinds of stories that you want to pick. So, I mean, I really like the paper. I just think it kind of needs some.
Nikki, I missed the book that you plugged. It's just was really good.
I'm sorry. The book that I plugged was Zahler, Public Opinion, Z-A-L-L-E-R.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thomas?
Okay. Yeah. So thanks again. By the way, I really appreciate. I mean, this is good because you guys are definitely making me think like harder and harder, and I'm almost like next time like this should be done in the research design stage. But I think one thing that you point out, and yeah, I mean, it's the framing, and I agree. Is we don't want it to be like a sleight of hand, like we're talking about conflict, and boom, we're measuring attitudes. But I do think that, I think the case for Turkey in this sense is that, if it's the reason why I think Turkey is a good case to studying refugees is because in the other areas, like when, Megan was talking about Africa and some of these, it's confounded by state capacity. So refugees could be there, but it could also be state capacity. It could be all these other things that are correlated with a weak state. So, that doesn't let you study kind of the refugee crisis because that's kind of and that was our thinking in Turkey, and whether you agree with that or not, that's kind of our sort of way of we were conceptualizing it as now Turkey is not a weak state, so this allows us to at least look at what is the direct effect of refugees. I think that one of the things that we do actually have data on. So how people actually feel towards the refugees, and we haven't yet figured out a way to kind of present this. But in general, it's basically, Kurds are nicer to the refugees, and have warmer feelings than non-Kurds, and the economic cost treatment seems to make them nicer to the non-Kurd, the other refugees than the non-Kurds. And we're still kind of parsing out what exactly does that mean. So we have more data, and the big thing is we don't want to make this just a results paper where we're listing a laundry list. So I agree, it's like kind of a theory would maybe help us kind of bridge that gap. So yeah, I guess that's our main thoughts.
Let me insert myself as a 2, and then we're going to Yuri, Ali, Jim, and then Jennifer. My 2 is. Similar to Nikki, I had kind of a response to the framing in certain respects, but I was wondering, there's stuff like by Carl Dieter Opp and Rule and Klondermans and Jim Gibson and Darren Davis and Ruud Koopmans that speaks about opinions regarding individuals in conflict situations that I think would be relevant. I didn't completely feel like it was a kind of sleight of hand, but because I do think that there are kind of attitudinal and opinion basis for a lot of the conflict studies that you were identifying, but I do think some of this other literature could get you to some of these bridges, right? Because you are kind of talking about terrorism and counterinsurgency on one hand and then protests on another. It's all contentious politics to me, so I'm happy about that, but there are distinct literatures with regards to how they're being investigated that I think you could serve, your piece could serve as a bridge to towards, and like Carl Dieter Opp in particular is relevant for some perceptions of protest stuff. Koopmans and the others as well, I think, would be directly relevant to that. Yuri.
Hey, Thomas. Cool paper. Just a couple quick thoughts. So, like Nikki, one piece that I found bit lacking in this paper is some kind of theoretical expectation of why refugees should affect some groups more than others, or some groups differently than others. So a lot of your empirics focus on breaking down the data in various ways, stratifying it Kurds versus non-Kurds. But I was still kind of going into this with a flat prior about why this refugee influx should affect Kurds differently than non-Kurds, and beyond that, why perhaps also an elaboration of how it would affect different economic groups more than others. So you mentioned a lot of these refugees are opening up retail shops. Okay, so people who are involved in the retail services sector should be affected differently than, say, someone who works in manufacturing. So what kind of cleavages are there in Turkish society, and how do and how will the influx of refugees impact them differently? What's the ethnic breakdown of the Syrian refugees moving in? Do Kurds stand to lose or gain from this influx? What implications does it have for the peace process itself? Does it give them a stronger or weaker hand in bargaining with the state? And if you flesh that out a little more, that will then help you out later on when you have these somewhat puzzling findings where you have people. So, for instance, some factors you have. So you have support for the peace process correlating with support for violence. And some of the tables, why is that? And if you flesh out how this influx would impact the situation on the ground. Basically, is there anything that the literature on refugees, are there any specific predictions we should draw from that literature for this particular case? And then like some people have mentioned already, I thought the Gezi Park story is somewhat unrelated to the larger story where it seems like your main contribution here is you're testing the mechanisms that Adine and Christian put on the table. And Gezi Park strikes me as a story that's much more kind of context specific. It's not really clear how that maps onto our theoretical expectations about what kind of mechanisms are impacting what. That strikes me as a somewhat different paper, but unfortunately it's also your strongest results empirically so far. So there's, but you know, just because that's the case doesn't mean that the theoretical story should be right, should be clear to the reader. And just quickly on the empirics themselves, I was wondering why you chose to just fully stratify the samples, Kurds versus non-Kurds, high exposure to refugees versus low exposure, because it strikes me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you're basically running separate regressions on each of these, as opposed to doing. I understand why you wouldn't want to pool, but why fully stratify? Because there you're simply assuming that the errors are independent across those subgroups, and that limits your ability to make cross-group comparisons. So maybe like a random coefficient model could help you a little more. And finally, on policy implications. So the interesting thing here is that it seems like priming and exposure have two different kinds of effects. And if I'm the Turkish government, what does that mean for me? Because lately there's been a lot of discussion about crackdowns on free press and crackdowns on Twitter and things like that within Turkey. And it seems to me that if exposure to refugees is more decisive here than priming or any kind of framing that you would have in the media, it seems like what the Turkish government should be more concerned about is where do we place these camps in the first place, rather than how do we control the flow of information. So I think you potentially have an interesting story to tell there from a policy standpoint. That could be one way to flesh out that section of the paper. Anyway, that's what I have. I'll turn it over to whoever's next on the list. And
Thomas, you want to respond, and then we'll go. Then we have two twos, David and Megan, unless you want to hear them as they're related.
Yeah, just a couple of quick things. I agree. So I'm definitely the theory. That's obviously, and that's something that we're still pushing on. I mean, we came in basically trying to test these mechanisms. I think the flat prior. So one of our issues. So it is true, is right. Is that so Kurds are both discriminated against, and they tend to be poor in Turkey. I mean, the Kurdish regions are poor, and it's not surprising given the history of violence. So that is, in some sense, right, is that in our sample that's generally confounded as that Kurds on average are poorer than non-Kurds. I didn't quite, and maybe Yuri, you can, I can ask you kind of a direct question. I didn't get, so we look at kind of a pooled model where we interact Kurds and with our treatments, and then we also look at a separate regressions for Kurds versus non-Kurds. I didn't get, though, quite with what you were talking about on. So the only thing that we're stratified, our sample is stratified, and that's and we also run weighted regressions afterwards to show that it's not terribly different. It's not just a gain in efficiency from our sample. But I'm not sure what you meant by sort of the comment you made about I think what did you say about our actual method being weird? So I wasn't quite sure what you were talking about there. Sorry.
Quick clarification, Yuri. You get 10 seconds.
Yeah, so when you partition the data into separate regressions, you're assuming that the errors are independent across those regressions. So whatever unobservable factors might be driving something in regression A are independent of whatever factors are driving regression B. But if you have Kurds and non-Kurds living in the same village, that independence assumption seems to me a little heroic. And so I understand why you did that. I understand why you want to perfectly pool them. But one way just to get around this is to run a random coefficient model, estimate separate slopes for Kurds, separate slopes for non-Kurds. You kind of do that in the interaction model. The random coefficient is just another way to do that.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. We also have used, so we also reran it with district level fixed effects, and what you end up seeing, and why we're not pushing super hard. I mean, the refugee exposure is still significant. The individual level, but it's a little less significant. And we think that, not surprising, refugee exposure is also related to where people live, and that's we think is kind of, there's a lot of things that are being related to living close to a border area. So we want to unpack that more, but we don't know yet. We wouldn't feel comfortable saying, refugee exposure does this, because we think, there are a lot of other things that are probably related to refugee exposure that are not random and that are also related to our dependent variable. Sorry. Did you
want to respond to anything else before we go to David and Megan? Okay, or now Megan, because David just scratched.
Just related to the empirics, I also had some similar concerns about all of the interaction effects and also the number of observations that I'm interested in. You give the overall response rate for the survey, but not item non-response. And given what you've said, and the sensitivity of certain questions, I would be interested in seeing overall breakdown when you present the questions, just show the distribution, because I suspect there obviously quite a few. The N goes down for some of these, and then like on table 12 it's like 77 or 187, and if in fact Kurds mostly live in OHAL, then that the OHAL factor who are non-Kurds, it's they're driving a certain number of results. So I think I would like to see the distributions on all of the variables, descriptive distributions and missing, and then if there is item missing, what those are and the implications of item missingness, and maybe some modeling of item missingness and Heckman or something like that, if it's significant. I have no idea because I haven't seen it. Some of the control variables like religion, I'm wondering if that also results in missingness, because people don't, I don't know what the norm is in Turkey, but asking about prayer, sometimes there's a stigma around that, and Erdogan's background section on the refugees could be the extent to which they might perceive the refugees being more religious and potentially supportive of the AKP government. And so I'm curious to see the results on religion. And then presenting the empirics, it would be great to have, when you do the interaction terms, to actually have the interpretation of the coefficient, adding the coefficients and their joint significance. Because you only present the interaction terms, you're shaking your head, so maybe you do present the joint significance of some of the coefficients. But it would be nice to have a little anecdote, like your typical control respondent is, this, and then if he lives in a Kurdish if he's Kurdish, just a kind of interpretation that's a little bit more substantive, with some examples of what, your average respondent is a 35-year-old guy, and if he's suddenly Kurdish, his response changes in this way. Especially since some of your findings are sort of surprising and specific to subgroups, that it would really help the reader understand what's really happening with the data. Sorry, that was a lot more than a 2.
No problem. Ollie.
Hi. I'll also say that I just read the paper before coming to this meeting, and I liked the idea, but I think there are a few issues that I need to be clear about. One is the sampling issue. On this, I mean, what is this sample supposed to represent? I'm not sure if you have this all sophisticated stratification method that you talk about. I think at the first step, you have to explain why and what you're actually trying to represent here. And since these are attitudes, to be the devil's advocate, I would rather have, you know, selected a sample from the region where, you know, the conflict is closest to, as opposed to the rest of the country. And that might have, you know, led to much clearer results. I'm not sure how the randomization, for instance, within the household works. Do you pre-assign a treatment to the interviewer, or the interviewer there decides which treatment to actually use? I say this because it's the, as you know, in a face-to-face setting, which I'm not sure even whether this was face-to-face or not, but in a face-to-face setting, it's absolutely critical not to give any initiative to the interviewer to select which treatment to use in which household, because then they'll do strategic picking of the treatments, which exactly what you want to avoid. You have to be able to be very strict about which treatment should be applied in every household prior to going to the household. And also the other minor issue is, I think you say at the beginning that, you know, you start the questionnaire with basic demographics, and I think my hunch is that your primary language question is part of that demographic, or is it not? I'm not sure. But if it is, then I would think you also mentioned that somewhere, that, you know, this could give yet another stimulus to respondents, you know, asking them about their native language. So I would think it would have been much better if you only asked. I'm not sure how you did it, but I would think what I would have done is to ask anything about the ethnic identity of the respondent after everything was completed and at the very end of the interview. But I'm not sure I follow how you did it in the text. The last issue here is, my hunch is that the results that I see basically are primarily non-results. I mean, when I look at your figures, most of the figures show that, you know, your and the tables also, you know, the treatments were insignificant. Only in a few treatments you obtain significant results. Or am I misreading the tables or figures? And I mean, you know, even Kurdishness doesn't help. So in that sense, there are only a few cases where you obtain significant results. And however, when you read the paper, the conclusion section, what you get is basically all of these, you know, you get the impression that, you know, the treatments were quite successful in obtaining significant differences between these groups. My reading of the tables is that for most, it just didn't work. There is no significant difference, neither for Kurds nor for for the Turks. But I might be misreading the table. So the last item, many people before me have already touched.
Your second last item, Ali. This is you just had a last one, but I'll give you a second last one. All right, yes.
This is the second last. The Gezi link to me as well is not at all convincing. I mean, I've been there, and what I know is that the Kurds did not support Gezi, and the Kurdish leadership basically was very consciously telling to their people that, you know, don't go out, don't protest. Gezi is not something we want to touch, because they were afraid that Gezi would turn into a Kurdish-Turkish fight, which, by the way, has happened very recently in a minor setting due to Kobane incident, for instance. But I think if I were to rewrite the paper, I would take out the Gezi and focus mostly on the impact on the refugees, perceptions of refugees. And I'm afraid there also there aren't that much significant results. But let me hear if I read the tables and the figures correctly first, and then we move on.
All right, a bunch of points. One is I appreciate the comments. It's, again, this is really helpful. The reason why we sampled where we did, so we have variation. This was not, we weren't trying to be nationally representative because, one, we didn't make sense. I mean, there are some refugees in Istanbul, but again, those are very different from, those are generally tend to be the people, not all of them, but the refugees, several of the refugees who ended up in Istanbul are very different from those that, live in camps, or most of them, in fact, are living outside of camps. So we wanted to get variation on the refugees, variation on the Kurdish conflict, and then we also wanted variation from the provinces that are closer to those areas, because they are still, much closer to the cultural and all the other sort of demographics than doing something way out in Istanbul. I mean, Turkey is a big country. I mean, to me, it'd be like saying, Megan was talking about it, but, and I talked to my Turkish co-author, Tolga, we talked about it, and Tolga is also G-chatting me now, so some of his comments will be reflected in what I'm saying. But I mean, it'd be like saying, we're interested in, in understanding the influence of, Mexican refugees that live along the border in Texas, and using as your control group, I don't know, Minnesota, right? There's a huge difference there. So our idea with our sample was to get kind of, try to eliminate that, as much as possible, while still reflecting our main kind of variables of interest, which was exposure to refugees and exposure to the conflict. We did not, it's a good point, is we did not ask about language. I mean, if somebody couldn't speak Turkish, we had Kurdish enumerators in these areas, and the survey, and it was only 2% where it was conducted in Kurdish, but we asked afterwards about, we never asked people directly, are you a Kurd? We asked, we gave them a list of groups, and we asked them how much they identified as being a Turkish citizen versus Turkish versus Kurdish versus Zaza, all these kind of the traditional groups. We did ask, though, and our Kurdish measure was if Kurdish was your first language. And there are issues. I mean, this is something I always wrestle. So I do a lot of work in Israel with Palestinian Israelis and Jewish Israelis, and this is always an issue, right? Is the kind of language effects. So this is something we kind of to ask people which one they would be most comfortable with, and we were we're cognizant of the fact that identity is a big issue. And you're right, if we were to upfront ask people these questions, that would be kind of bad news, because then we'd be just priming identity. I think, and I think you bring up an interesting point is, yes, in some sense, right, is, the Gezi Park protest, I mean, it's tricky because it's, we would argue that it was a main issue of kind of conflict within Turkey, and it's not directly related to the Turkish-Kurdish conflict. In some sense, it's, orthogonal, as we show that Kurds, about an equal number of Kurds and non-Kurds are AKP supporters. But we thought it would also be interesting to kind of tease out, because there is the concern that a lot of people make, and people made this in the U.S. case with the refugees from Hurricane Katrina, that there was an anti-incumbent effect from the refugees. So we wanted to, I mean, our reason for including kind of Gezi, is this kind of, we call it good governance, but it might be more appropriate to label it as sort of an anti-incumbent feeling. So that's something I think, yes, theoretically we want to sort of think about more. I'm trying to think. I think that's pretty much all of...
On the end of that, and I'll let you kind of like trail off, and then before we go to Jacquelien, my two on that was, I like your more encompassing view of what do people think about conflict, and how are those perceptions of conflict influenced by having this refugee population come in from another conflict area. That's fine, but Ideen and Christian's piece that you're using as the setup is not about generally how is conflict affected. And it is a very specific context, and much of the literature used in the front end is kind of about how is this particular form of conflict affected by refugees. So if you take this more encompassing thing, how are conflict dynamics within a country offset or affected by this new population coming in, I think that's a different frame, but that gets you to the more encompassing thing that you want. And Jacquelien. I thought I had you on the list.
She's muted and might not know how to unmute it.
That would be a problem.
But I think Will muted her initially, so perhaps he can undo it.
No, I think I did.
Oh.
And I'm trying to free Jacquelien right now, which is just horrible because it's not like I cannot free you. Sorry, does not work. Oh wow, that's just completely messed up. How do I undo it? I'm like, okay, I had it muted and then I unmuted her. Wow, that sucks. I'm so sorry about that. After I try to
unmute herself, because sometimes I calls where I muted myself too.
Okay, Jacquelien, please push everything, and in the meantime, David, go ahead.
Okay, so there are a couple additional comments I wanted to make. First of all, I wanted to come back to something Yuri said on the phrasing of the specific hypotheses. I think we really do need to know the specific hypotheses here that are being tested, and I'm not a randomista, but my understanding is the state of the art now is that the best practice is that you can't say things like you do on page 17, which is that our primary research questions are, 1, do the primes shift attitudes in any direction? And then 2, are the experimental effects different? So in other words, are treatments significant or not, and are there heterogeneous treatment effects without outlining theoretically why you expect them to be different and what direction they might be? For people who don't do experiments, that just kind of rubs me as let's just throw things at the wall and see what sticks, which we can talk about the pros and cons of doing that, but my sense is that the experiments literature is moving away from that sort of a setup of hypotheses and really getting into the specifics. And I think doing that will allow you to address some of these other issues that people have been raising. On 2 additional points, it's hard for me to think about it on details of Turkey. It's hard for me to think about a paper on whether or not the inflow of Syrian refugees in Turkey changes people's expectations of ethnic conflict, without at least some mention of the bombings in Reyhanli. For those of you who don't know, there was a very large bombing in May 2013 that it's probably it is the most important spillover from the Syrian civil war into Turkey. And my sense is Turks were scared to death of that spreading throughout the country and that becoming a larger attack. I think the conventional wisdom is that it was linked to the Syrian regime, but it was basically Arab Alawites, not Alevis, Alawites who were living in Antakya, who were allied with the Syrian regime, who were responsible for this. And so I think at least framing things around that in the introduction, I think, would help address some of these other concerns. And then finally, if you do want to repeat this, I think you have this. One problem with repeating is that things changed about 2 weeks ago, right? 2 weeks ago, the Turkish government started bombing the PKK for the first time in at least a year and a half, if not 2 years. And so I like the idea of repeating it, but it's unclear how that renewal of confrontation, if you want to call it that, or at least break down the peace process in some way, it allows you to do that. Let me leave that. I've got some other things, but we don't have that much time left. I want to make sure Jacquelien gets in.
Nikki added 2. Nikki, go.
He's muted.
I didn't mute him.
Just a quick one. So I'm an outsider to this particular literature, but maybe I didn't catch this. Why is it that if I'm a Kurd and I hear that these Syrian guys are violent, I will actually want to pursue a violent conflict? I mean, wouldn't I want to kind of settle the conflict in Turkey so that we don't have to deal with these other guys? And it just, I'm really, some of these I really had no sort of, why do I want this? Why would I want, I mean, I understand this kind of, I want better governance thing, that kind of makes sense to me, but why should I have to support more or less violence, and against who? That was just totally different.
Thomas is quiet. Jen.
There we go. I'm not muted, am I?
No, you were not.
Okay, great. So this is about refugee exposure, the effect of refugee exposure. So it's associated with more negative feelings towards refugees and support for group violence, and this is actually one of the largest results from a substantive standpoint. And so my question is, how do we know that none of the claims made by Salyan and Gledish aren't actually operating in high refugee areas to produce these effects? So I guess another way of thinking about this is that it's not clear to me that any of your experimental results rule out the possibility that things like, or any of those claims that are made by in the Gledish paper aren't responsible for the effect of refugee exposure. So you interpret your survey experiment results as sort of challenging the claims made by that paper, but not clear to me that some of what's going on in that paper can't be operating to explain the refugee exposure effect, and I didn't know what you thought about that. That was even plausible.
Okay, a couple of responses. So one is, yeah. So to David's point, I mean, yes, Hatay was a huge deal, but Hatay is also like kind of a funky province. I mean, it's like the only Arab majority province in Turkey, and there are other things that are going on there, and they are in our sample, and we've thought about sort of looking at Hatay specifically, but it's also kind of not, or I would say not a representative case of the rest of kind of the areas that we're interested in. But it is an important case. I think the other thing that a lot of people, you guys are saying, is that, you know, this is not, you know, Gledish and Salyan are not talking about, they're talking about civil war, and they're not talking about perceptions, but in fact that's one of their main points in the paper, is that it could be actual or, you know, perceptions about the refugees. And so I think actually our paper is tighter to that than a lot of you guys are arguing and forgetting, that that's one of the main things that they talk about is perceptions, and that's what we're measuring. In terms of, you know, Jen, you bring up a good point, and that's something that we've thought about, is this kind of, you know, what is actually going on in trying to break up the refugee exposure thing. So one of the things that we do in figures 6, 7, and 8, is that we look at the effects disaggregated by Kurds and non-Kurds, by low and high exposure, because that was one thing we were wondering, is basically, is our treatment driven by people getting the certain treatment but are not really exposed to refugees, right? So that was one of the things that we were wondering. And we don't see, I mean, in fact, the effects seem to be, I mean, there's a smaller number of people that have like a high level of exposure. We had those in the top quartile of refugee exposure, but they don't seem to be responding that differently, and especially like the Kurds, the economic cost treatment is actually slightly more for those that are highly exposed. But again, right, this exposure is not random, so it's, you know, we don't want to lean too heavily on the results, but we're happy that it's not like we're seeing results go in the opposite direction based on high and low exposure. So that's all. And then also Tolga, my colleague, is also saying that there is not a breakdown in the peace process. In fact, that, you know, the BDP representatives just met with the Prime Minister and said that the process will continue. So that's it. But you're right. It's granted, a lot of things have changed, David, so that would make, you know, and we're thinking about other things to test in the future. Sorry. Go.
Ali on it too.
I wonder, you have lots of control variables that you did not include in your tables. for obvious space considerations. But some of, I mean, these control variables make the testing so demanding for your hypotheses. I wonder, for instance, I mean, the day of the interview was also one of the controls, right? So I wonder how many of those were significant, since many of the treatments turn out to be insignificant because, most likely, because of the other control variables that turned out to be significant. And many people, I think, would argue that just a simple t-test would be fine without any, controls, since you do randomization. And you report at the beginning that, randomization did really work. Where was this? Table 4. So it turns out that randomization did work, but you have lots of controls which may turn out to be quite significant. I wonder whether they did or not.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point. I mean, yes, is to look at some of the controls. I mean, a lot of the controls are related to each other. I mean, the reason why we choose the time of the day is because, again, our big worry was the surveys getting rolled out, and luckily, we didn't have the Turkish drivers were not, kidnapped during our survey. But I think the main thing, right, and you make a point, and I think our point would be somewhat similar, is that, we have this, I would argue, fairly modest but, pretty significant effect for Kurds and the economic cost. But for the most part, a lot of what we're showing is that, we're not getting, and it's not that, if we remove the controls and just include, the simple, and perhaps we should show that, but for space we did not say that, but that removing those controls and just looking at the treatment effects, we don't really get much either way. It's not that we're kind of flipping signs by controlling for things. I think the main thing is that our results is that we get a modest but positive and significant effect on economic costs. But for the most part is these things that, and David and others were worried that we're giving these really, really strong treatments, right, and kind of double barrel. We're still not getting effects, which, to us suggests that, that these primes in and of themselves are not enough to that people are not moved by sort of these common mechanisms that people argue on these major issues, with the exception that, for Kurds, the economic cost, in fact, makes them less likely to support violence. I think our story is one of a kind of null, and in fact, there's actually a slight positive effect for the Kurds. That's our main kind of story. So I think, and I think that's where we're kind of pushing. Like, if we were arguing, we're getting these huge effects, and we're really moving people around on conflict, I think then, there would be, I think we would be a bit more concerned about some of the controls and what's going on. But I think the fact that we're still not getting that, and we are actually getting a slight positive effect, I think that kind of maybe convinces our argument that maybe we need to rethink sort of exactly how refugees are influencing conflict.
Will.
So, and now for something completely different. Thomas, I don't remember if you stuck around, were able to see my Peace Science address, but if you did, you know it's coming. So I've talked to Aideen a lot about this and been very unsuccessful. I really don't like biological analogies. And right, so you guys aren't that bad, but when we talk about spread, we're talking about human beings, and we're thinking about spreading disease. And that unfortunately plays into the negative connotation that the state likes to present conflict in, and the word instability connects to that. So I'm literally picking on some of the words that you choose to use, and it's hardly something that just you guys do. But I take a strong ethical position on this, and I want to encourage you guys to really think about whether that analogy. I argue that analogy isn't really what Aideen is talking about anyway. It doesn't actually capture the mechanisms very well. If you think about how biological agents spread, and if that is in fact what you're talking about, then stick with the analogy, I guess. But if it's not, then I'd encourage you to abandon it. So.
Eula.
Hey, I had one question about the response rate because it looked like about half of the people you approached also responded. So, because you just mentioned that the response rate is such, but how do you think that maybe affects your results? Like, who was more likely to drop out and who was more likely to take part? Like, is that kind of linked to what you're actually researching? Like, people who maybe care more or less about this, or like, I'm just wondering how that may be driving your results because it's maybe a pre-selection.
Yeah, I mean, so something we've thought about, and we have data on like the response rate across, obviously the districts, and that might be something to kind of put in an appendix to see. I mean, yes, I mean, this is the issue with surveys. We can only really generalize we can tell us how the response rate varied, but we can't really say a ton about those people who chose not to participate. We can only kind of match based on the data we have and the demographic data within the province. Perhaps we could do some kind of sensitivity analysis, but I mean, again, we'd have to make assumptions about the people who chose not to participate. And yes, I mean, we also know there was some dropout, across our survey in terms of certain questions like Gezi Park, people were less forthcoming on those. And people take different views on whether you should impute or not. I mean, I think just sort of looking at the pattern of missingness might help us get a better idea of what kind of were the really sensitive questions, and that's something to think about. But you're right, is that, that is the response rate we have, right? It's not, super high, but I also, think, in the U.S. case, it's what, like 10 to 12%. So these are, yeah. But
did you tell people beforehand, like, what the survey was about? So
we said just on current events. I mean, it was pretty agnostic.
Queue is open. I had a few things. One, the piece is ambitious in a bunch of different ways, and not only are you trying to kind of unify much of conflict studies, but I think that you're also kind of, normally there's less attention given to conflicts that have economic bases to them in the sense of like industrial conflict strikes and so forth. So the kind of increased competition for jobs mechanism seemed to kind of invoke that literature for me, but there's no discussion of the kind of economic situation or strikes or unions or anything like that. The ethnic balance is kind of like, okay, so you have a balance that would lead to a threat, and then you have a preemptive strike. And so I didn't really like the Christian and Ideen piece in the sense that I didn't think the mechanisms were that clearly laid out. So I was kind of like, all right, so get me to exactly how the conflict takes place, and then to your intervention point. So kind of like so point for domestic opposition. Okay, so is it weapons or bodies or whatever? I'm like, well, are weapons or bodies necessary for that particular conflict? So in a sense, you hinted a bunch of different conflicts, but you don't give me enough of an understanding of kind of I guess I'll be kind of old school social movement, right? So I'm like, for each conflict, give me the frame, grievances, mobilizing structure, tactical repertoire, and political opportunity structure, and then identify for me how refugees offset those dynamics. And so I wanted more of a kind of conceptualization to kind of lay out exactly what that was. I also felt like I didn't know the relationships, if at all, between Syria and the Kurdish population, both in Syria and in Turkey, and and then Syria-Turkey relationships, right? So I was like, to kind of get me the sense of what does an influx of this type of refugee population do for the Turkish population? Because if you had, like, let's say, a bunch of Ghanaians or Soviets folks coming to New York, no one's going to give a damn what the hell these people think, right? So because it's just like that culture is just completely dissed. So it's like, I presume that since they're next door, I presume that there's some awareness of the conflict. I presume there's also some sensitivity to the population as they come in, and some are just more predisposed to take information or perceptions from them a little bit differently. Because I started thinking about anti-refugee sentiments, xenophobia discussions, discrimination, anti-immigrant research. And this is the Koopman stuff to kind of show what kind of pushback domestic populations are giving. And I like the fact that you're bringing that literature in. And so, but if you think about it, you have this anti-immigration bit, you have a refugee bit from fleeing from a conflict, you have a protest policing dynamic. Of course, the protest policing part isn't really mentioned, but whatever. And then you have an insurgency, counterinsurgency dynamic. And so I like that there's all these different parts of the conflict that's going on, but I don't like the fact that I'm struggling to try to figure out how the different forms of conflict relate to one another and how these outsiders coming in might influence it. So I just wanted some kind of like conceptual figure to kind of show me how the different conflicts related to one another and how these populations or coming in would influence these dynamics in some way, shape, or form, either influencing your support for the government and what they're doing or for the challengers and what they're doing. And David, you had something.
Yeah, I just wanted to make two more points brought to mind after something Christian just said there. One is that I agree with a lot of people who are saying that the link between the refugee presence and opposition to the Turkish government is a big jump. And I think that's a particularly big jump because the Turkish government is extremely vocal in solving this refugee problem in two ways. They're by far of the countries in the region the one most actively pressing the United States and its allies to overthrow the Assad regime first, to do that before they go after ISIS. And they're the ones who again and again and again are calling for an internationally protected no-fly zone and refugee zone, not in Turkey, but in Syria. So they want the international community to carve out that northern strip of Syria for the refugees to go back to. And so even if you were anti-refugee and you saw, not anti-refugee, if you saw with the problem, if you saw the refugees as leading to economic problems and potentially destabilizing Turkey, it's not obvious to me why a Turk would expect that to translate. The government has really stood its ground in presenting a solution to that refugee problem. So that was a big jump. Finally, the one thing something Christians had made me think of this. I could be mistaken, but the Turkish constitution says that you can apply for Turkish citizenship after 5 years of being in Turkey legally. And so a lot of these refugees have been coming. A lot of them started coming in mid-2012. So they're going to be eligible to apply for Turkish citizenship by the end of 2016, early 2017. And my sense is that the Prime Minister's office, which is responsible for a lot of the survey, they're trying to control who does surveys in the Kurdish areas. I'm sorry, in the refugee camps. But the other people who've done surveys within the camps, my sense is the data show that quite a bit of these refugees would like to get dual citizenship, and they'd like to get Turkish citizenship. So I think this is the project moving forward. I think adding questions about that risk of them getting Turkish citizenship and applying for Turkish citizenship, I think might catch some of these feelings that Christian was highlighting, and that I think probably will really get you some stuff.
So Thomas, you can respond to these questions if you so choose. Something that we've been doing for the last couple of sessions is we've been letting the author kind of go, all right, well, look, you have access to these people, and you have a bunch of information that's been tossed out to you. Is there any kind of questions you'd like to pop back to the group to kind of get a quick feeling thermometer of kind of like a direction or two that you might want to take?
Yeah, I mean, so one is, first of all, like I really appreciate. One is I love, this kind of, the comments were good and tough, and that's like needed, and it's like really helpful, and it's hard to get sometimes people to be like brutally nice. No, you're not brutally nice. Sorry, the opposite of brutally nice, brutally honest, which I really appreciate, and I like having been in NYU PhD. It feels like home on here, so I appreciate that. I think the big thing for us is, so we are looking to we have like a couple of ideas going forward on where we want to go with the project, kind of like a follow-up. So the couple, and I'll just toss this out, so and I'll be very succinct. So one follow-up is kind of do this and look at, okay, we have Kobani now. So understanding the difference, is it refugees that kind of change things, or is it what's going on the other side of the border, this kind of ethnic tie thing? So that would be one thing to kind of separate out these different mechanisms. The second thing that we were thinking about potentially doing, and we think this is maybe potentially as interesting, is to look at the effect of the fact that you have this kind of trade-off. So in some sense, does Turkey let the Kurds go fight? In all the instability that happened around Kobani was the kind of sealing of the border and the preventing of them kind of going to the aid of the Kurds on the other side. So how do Turks weigh the trade-off of letting Kurds go fight with the problem that maybe this one comes back to bite them, and that you have these fighters coming back, or the worry that they have a kind of Kurdish state or some kind of Kurdish autonomy right on Turkey's border. So doing something about the kind of trade-off between fighting domestic repression versus allowing them to fight and kind of being a problem in the future. And the third thing would be to kind of just do almost an exact replication of this, but knowing that a lot of things have changed since then. So those are kind of the three different projects we've sort of have been tossing around a little bit. So I'd love to get feedback on what people think.
Open queue. Anybody respond?
I think whatever you decide to do, you should go for just doing things with more precision, because that's what really experiments are good for. So just kind of convince us of whatever. Just pick whatever you think is the most interesting and say, okay, this is a simple story, it works, period.
Yeah, I'd encourage you to go back to Jen's initial points. It would be nice to really establish what these treatments are outside of your actual experiment. So if you get a chance to go back, see if you can, once you translate it to Turkish or Kurdish, right, counting those words, all that sort of stuff. The other thing, just piggybacking on something that Christian and David said toward the end, I'd encourage you to, and I think this is also consistent with Nikki's point, think a little bit more carefully about focusing in on all the different things that are happening, protest police dynamics, the anti-incumbency, and try and parse some of that before you go back to the field, because I think that's more important necessarily than being able to tie back to the one you've already done, from my perspective.
Well, you might as well wrap up. We are at the end.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for everybody joining us. We're a little more crowded today than we normally are, but we really appreciate it. Obviously, there would not be a virtual workshop without people willing to read and take seriously people's work. So thanks to all of you who were uncompensated but jumped on and participated in this. If you think there's a community out there that you know of that would benefit from this, Christian and I are please steal this idea. We like this technology and hope that others find it useful and creative ways to do it. Finally, if you know junior people, junior faculty, graduate students who you think would benefit from participating in our workshop in the future, we'll have a call coming out in a couple of weeks. For the spring, we'll be doing 6 more. In the spring, we've got 1 more for this fall, but the call will be coming out in early to mid-December. Please encourage folks to send in their papers. Thank you all.
Peace. Thank you.
Thanks. This was fun.